Hey, welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Security Ledger podcast. I'm Paul Roberts, and I am the host and editor-in-chief here at the Security Ledger. And we are thrilled to have with us Ross McKerchar, who is the CISO, Chief Information Security Officer at Sophos, to talk about a really pretty astounding report Sophos put out late last month in October on a sustained APT attack, nation state attack on their organization and others as well, dubbed Pacific Rim. And Russ, welcome.
Yeah, great to be here. Thanks, Paul.
It's great to have you. I think it's the first time and honored to have you on. Before we get going, just for our listeners who aren't familiar with you, just give us a little bit of your origin story and just talk about the work you're doing at Sophos.
Yeah, sure. Not a terribly exciting origin story. I've been at Sophos almost straight out of university for 17 years now. Yeah, started on the kind of Linux security side of things, and I've just been lucky enough to grow with grow with the company basically, and build up a team as the company grew. My role now, typical kind of CISO role, I guess, responsible for kind of all aspects, all the way through from certifications and compliance through product security, corporate security, just the full works here. Very similar to a CISO role at, I guess, another tech company, although obviously doing it for a security company has its own kind of unique set of challenges, and it does tend to draw you into the product side, I guess, more than many other CISO roles, although corporate's obviously important as well.
Okay, so let's talk about the Pacific Rim report released on Halloween.
Yeah.
Coincidence? It was pretty scary.
It was genuine coincidence. We were expecting the odd kind of bad headline from it, but by and large, it's fine.
Pretty scary report. So for listeners who haven't read it yet, and obviously we'll link to it in the blog post that accompanies the podcast, could you give us just a rundown of this campaign and what happened when Sophos became aware of this campaign and how it played out?
Yeah, sure. So it is unusual compared to normal reports or disclosures around specific campaigns, because we're not just talking about one single event or incident. This is actually 6 years of back and forth with a kind of loose-knit group of PRC China-based actors. It's the main arc of the story. It kicks off with a more kind of I guess a traditional attack, if you will, against a subsidiary of ours out in India through a company we acquired called Cybersecurity. That kicked off as a relatively run-of-the-mill incident. We detected a network scan of our Sophos environment originating from the Cybersecurity environment. We kept the companies relatively separate at the time of that attack. So we started tracing it back and found a compromise. There's one of those devices. It wasn't a Raspberry Pi. I think it was an Intel NUC, but it powers an overhead display in the office. So just a little low-powered device. Get into that, start doing forensics, and it's kind of quite uninteresting at this stage. Obviously, it's an potentially internal breach, quite an important for us to investigate, but it looked relatively unsophisticated, kind of basic Linux tradecraft, living off the land, standard Linux tooling. And then we start tracing the attack back. We obviously clean it up, but that's not enough. We need to understand how they got in, et cetera, et cetera. And there were a few points where, as we trace this attack back, so we figure out what was the device that they logged in from, that they accessed this little NUC from. And it just gets this kind of series of escalating kind of situations where, oh, that's quite clever. Oh, we haven't seen that before. Oh, that's interesting.
These don't look like script kiddies.
Right. Yeah. So we realized it wasn't script kiddies quite quickly in that incident. We saw, for instance, we were using, this was an on-premise environment, but we also had some of these devices in that environment managed by AWS SSM, which is quite a new technology at the time. They'd actually used that in a really interesting way to pivot into cloud assets. And that's like a big uptick in capability from someone who we thought at that time was more standard, common Linux tooling, open source malware. So that was interesting. And then finally, we traced back what we now call Cloud Snooper. We disclosed at the time as Cloud Snooper. Really interesting rootkit, very stealthy. We actually had a couple of consultancies helping us through this, and both of them did forensics on this system and couldn't find it. It was only because we've got some people on my team who are very good at this as well, that we actually found it internally. But yeah, very, very well hidden. So that was just the first incident.
So now you've got advanced cloud-based techniques and a custom rootkit. So now you're thinking, okay,
Yeah, yeah. So that now we're thinking, okay, we thought, okay, this is gonna be hard work. So it was actually one of the major catalysts for us integrating that company entirely. We essentially just burned it all down to the ground and built it back up again because we knew it was a pretty nasty situation. What we didn't realize at the time was that was just the start. What we now know was that was a reconnaissance gathering exercise. They had wider ambitions. That the target wasn't really us. The target was our customers. And I think about 18 months after that, maybe a couple of years actually, during the middle of COVID, where we saw this kind of higher scale activity kick off. The COVID link's important because they were attacking not us, but our customer devices in the field. And because of COVID, a lot of our customers had configured their firewalls to be much more remotely accessible than they were previously, because obviously everyone had gone to work from home. So things like administrative portals that maybe wouldn't necessarily be so commonly configured to be on the internet were internet and WAN facing. So that was a kind of what I'd say is an at-scale attack. It was targeting tens of thousands of our customers. And we were a bit on the back foot at that point in terms of we found out about it because of a customer report, which I don't like to do. See, much better to find out about things before your customers find out about things. And what we now know, they were trying to build what we call orbs, so operational relay boxes. It's not the Sophos term that's used quite a lot. A subset of a type of botnet, basically, but used by more advanced attackers to obfuscate the true origin of the attacks.
You bring up orbs, and this is a really interesting kind of concept that I think has emerged in the past few years. So these are often kind of low value, could be consumer devices or kind of low value, but internet connected devices that nation state actors will assemble and then utilize as a platform for second and third stage attacks
Yeah,
on,
that's right. Yeah,
targets.
I think the term actually originated in the intelligence community. Like I think the Five Eyes use this kind of terminology a bit, but I think it's becoming more industry standard as
Yeah.
well. Google, Mandiant do a good article on them as well. Yeah, they're basically botnets, but I think more specifically, they're botnets used for a very distinct purpose. We're not talking about DDoS wars, script kiddies here. And
Right.
whilst, yeah, they can be built out of maybe lower value devices, I think that the actors actually quite like enterprise devices as well for these, because if you're on an edge device in an enterprise in the same country as your end target, that's just a brilliant place to be. You've got high bandwidth, you're always on, you're coming from more trusted IP space, obfuscates your true origin. So I think PRC-based actors, the various typhoons particularly, are well known to use these types of techniques. I think it's important for maybe mid-market organizations particularly to think about these kind of threats. Historically, ransomware has been the big driver of kind of risk for those organizations, and maybe not considering the more nation state actors as being
Return
interested in
view.
them.
Yeah.
But if you are at this point, you become collateral damage in a wider operation where your infrastructure can be abused to attack another organization. Not a great situation. But then there's actually other reasons why mid-market might be a target for some of these, for particularly PRC-based actors. They're known to be pre-positioning themselves to target critical infrastructure as well. And a lot of the mid-market, they might not, some of them do, but they might not all have very high value intellectual property, but they could be like a hospital, healthcare, maybe not a lot of IP in that environment, but it's absolutely very important critical infrastructure. So that's another reason why, as well as building orbs, the mid-market really needs to, or the whole market, not just the mid-market, the whole market really needs to think about their hygiene when it comes to running these devices on their perimeter. And obviously not just Sophos devices. One of the key learnings, and as we've collaborated with others on this report and just looking at news events, is that this targeting of these perimeter devices is really prolific. If you look at the CISO's latest report on the KEV list, they've listed out the top 15. The top 6 of those top 15 are all perimeter device attacks. And interestingly, they also call out a lot of use of 0 days as well, much more than they were last year. So yeah, this threat is high at the moment. It's a really challenging area for the industry. And that's one reason why we're so keen to do this report, just get that understanding out there.
In your research, I'm guessing that wasn't the only appliance they were targeting, that you were part of a broader campaign of just whole category of these types
Yeah.
of edge devices?
We're pretty confident of that. One because we've collaborated with other vendors, and I think as we'll get to this part of the story in a bit, but we got pretty good at identifying some of the kind of behind the scenes groups that were actually doing some of the exploit development, and we actually with some other vendors we shared some of that intel quite a few years ago now, and they were seeing activity from those same cluster of IP addresses. Secondly, we with law enforcement help we managed to gain access to one of their C2 servers. And actually, we took that over. We gain access to the domains through a court order. We then point that domain at a server under our control, not one of the attacker's servers. And then we can see all the HTTP requests coming in for the C2.
Right.
And the user agent strings that were associated were not our user agent strings. And obviously, user agent strings you can't be 100% confident in, but they're indicative of there are clearly other vendor devices in those. So yes, this is definitely an industry-wide concern for sure.
So one of the really interesting aspects of the Pacific Rim report was the inferences you were able to make about the structure of China's offensive cyber operation, how you were able to trace back the origins for some of these compromises to universities and private sector firms in China who it would seem are working hand in glove with the PLA or at least the Chinese Communist Party as part of these larger campaigns. I don't think anybody's going to be like, oh my God, I can't believe that. Yeah, we've all assumed that's going on, especially when wake of China requiring first look at ODAs and new vulnerability discovers. But to talk just a little bit about that and how that kind of played out in terms of the attack.
Yeah. And that was certainly, we found ourselves with this kind of really fascinating and unique insight into this. We didn't see it all claim to understand the whole ecosystem, and others, the Atlantic Council, for instance, that have done some really good research on this. And what we see, what we observed, it was more like we could just go deep into a specific kind of part of that ecosystem. So the way that unfolded was in some of these first kind of widespread attacks that we responded to against our customers, we started to see in our device telemetry these individual systems that had the same indicators of compromise as the rest of the rest of the fleet, but far earlier, months before. And we were initially thinking, oh, maybe they were testing it. Maybe this was just like an unfortunate kind of early victim. But as we dived into that more and started to marry up some of that data with our other back office systems, the kind of like the registration systems that you need to get. These are all primarily virtual devices. So you can go on a website, you can download a copy of our XG software and run it as a VM. The attackers did later actually get their hands on physical kit, but we'll get back to that later. So we started to actually change our minds about what we were seeing. It started to look more like this wasn't an actual attack. It was more of a test of an attack. So we start pulling on this thread. Again, that's interesting. We were doing that at the same time as responding to the first wave of attacks. And then there's only a couple of weeks after responding to the first wave, whilst we were trying to get our hands on, figure this out, the second wave of attacks hit us. This was really interesting because it was a very different type of attack. Like it's really like they'd learned their lesson in the first wave of attacks. But we were more prepared. We rolled out some improved telemetry across our environment. This is like internal system telemetry. It's things like hashes of unexpected files, processes on disk, things like that. And we were slightly better prepared. And that second attack gave us again a little bit more insight into these actors. And then it was actually it was between the second and the third attack that we made the big leap where we were like, okay, these are definitely attacker devices. We're very confident in that. It's not just vulnerability research, it was exploit development. The difference being it wasn't about finding the initial ways in, because obviously there's lots of kind of legitimate vulnerability development that goes on across the world. It was about chaining the way in with deploying kind of stealthy malware onto the devices.
Right.
We were confident it's very likely kind of malicious, kind of illegitimate activity. We were confident it was originated in the Chengdu region of China. So I guess the unusual step we took, which had had a lot of commentary across the industry was we had this telemetry that gave us a kind of like broad view. It can give us like a basic EDR, but we really need to get closer to these devices to really understand what's going on. That's when we deployed what we call the targeted implant. So it's a stealthy way, no problem, a stealthy way of us like really monitoring the attackers and the devices. We can get near term, near real time what they're typing in the key, on the keyboard, putting commands on the system. That alone is unusual in a firewall because you don't typically log into a firewall shell and actually type commands on the shell. Obviously, you're configuring it through a web interface or code. So that really proved its worth quite quickly, actually, because we actually managed to get our hands on an exploit, a vulnerability they had, and turning into an exploit and then patch it before they used it. So that was the first real the first real kind of measure of success that we had. We had to do funny things like we had to patch it like accidentally, like stealthily, because we were worried they were monitoring our hot fixes. So we're playing this kind of game of like thinking, like treating it like a game theory problem, trying to like second guess what they knew, what they were looking at. But we realized at this point we had this really valuable capability, and we were just able to milk that over a period of about two, 3 years to try and stay ahead of these adversaries. So they weren't able to use that third vulnerability at scale. We managed to patch that, and after that, I think it basically looks like they gave up on trying to do mass exploitation and build up these orbs. But by that point, we'd instrumented our firewall a bit better and we were much more paying really close attention to this stuff. And that allowed us to unlock this kind of ecosystem of much more targeted activity, so like high value targets. So the activity we observed really pivoted from those mass widespread attacks into just a real threat intelligence goldmine of really interesting victimology, very kind of obvious, ranging from like obvious espionage targets through to critical infrastructure targets. We could marry up a lot of the activity that we saw with kind of CCP objectives, like political objectives, and even their travel itineraries and travel plans as well. So we saw, an embassy being targeted just shortly before that embassy was due to host a CCP dignitary. So it was really interesting activity as well as really interesting malware. That's when we managed to uncover some very interesting, some other rootkits, and all the way up to a quite sophisticated rootkit, as well as even a bootkit, which you feed very low level malware. Yeah, it was an interesting few years, that's for sure.
The targeted implant aspect of it is one that, as you said, it has gotten a lot of attention. Sometimes it's got a little bit of a little shadow over it, but in this case, as you said, highly useful in the context of a sophisticated nation-state campaign of trying to stay one step ahead of a very widespread and sophisticated operation. Is this something that more organizations should be looking at rather than trying to button every button and check every lock in their incredibly diverse IT ecosystem of saying, what can we do to learn more about what they're up to and prepare?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. That kind of hits at the heart of why we're so keen to talk about this, knowing it was a device that we already had code execution on. So it wasn't like there was anything clever to get code running on it. Of it was defending forward, like monitoring, kind of threat intelligence collection to defend our customers. And there's clear value, obvious successes doing that. But it's a really good question because I think there is a lot of value in applying what I just call generically the detection and response principles to edge devices. And I think it's an and, not an or. So I think we need to continue to harden these devices. A lot of them, speaking across the industry here, not specifically on Sophos, we obviously invested very heavily in trying to shore up our devices as a result of some of this activity. But as an industry, a lot of these devices have quite legacy architectures. They weren't really built to withstand such a intense adversarial ecosystem where you're talking about what I understand is very large numbers of people doing really deep exploit research. Like we talked about legislation, when we get back to that, but like PRC legislation has really co-opted the entire country. It's the second largest country in the world by population right now, into like be able to harvest that entire country to identify exploits against these devices. So we have to recognize that whilst we have a lot of work to do to harden them and make them much harder to exploit, we need a plan for failure. This is a lesson that we learned in the endpoint world probably 10 years ago now, maybe even 15 years ago, where we made that shift from antivirus to endpoint detection and response. We realized that you have to have a plan for if your AV doesn't catch something. And that kind of gave birth to the endpoint detection and response movement. And now we're at the point where if you have good EDR deployed and you are crucially monitoring it well, which is obviously where things like MDR come in, because a lot of organizations aren't capable of monitoring EDR themselves. It's hard, right? But if you have that and you're looking at it and it's well deployed and it's a leading solution like ours, then it's actually quite hard to persist in a corporate network. And actually, that's one good reason I think why we're seeing threat actors go to these devices, because we haven't learned that lesson. So yes, to answer you bluntly, whilst it shouldn't be too big a distraction from hardening these devices, it very much is we should definitely be thinking about how we can detect and respond in these environments as well to counter this threat.
The next question is the hardest one for a software publisher, which is, as you said, a lot of these campaigns are contingent on ODAs or known exploitable vulnerabilities in commercial software, right? Whether that's VPN software or what have you. What does that mean for a company like Sophos in terms of your approach to, as you said, hardening devices and software that you're deploying to your customers? And given that we know you're never going to be able to be perfect, right? Like you're writing hundreds of thousands, millions of lines of code, like there's going to be X number of vulnerabilities in it. This is unavoidable. But now we know they're really targeting this. They're spending significant resources to find and exploit these vulnerabilities. How does that change things from a software publisher's point of view?
Yeah. Another reason we wanted to release this report is that we think it's a more constructive conversation to have if we recognize that secure software development is really hard. That may sound obvious, but I think...
And expensive.
Yeah, and expensive. Yeah. That might sound obvious, but I think a lot of the security industry has relied on pretending everything's perfect. Pretending that we can build perfectly secure software, not having a plan for failure. That's changing. So there are initiatives like the CISO Secure by Design initiative, which we've really leaned into. We signed up alongside many other vendors. That's got a lot of momentum. We've actually published quite a detailed blog article quite early on around how we're trying to not just adhere to the core principles, which we by and large met already, but taking it to the next step. Things like unphishable FIDO2-based authentication, for example, in our products, as well as moving to more modern memory safe languages. As an example, we've rewritten our VPN provisioning portal is a very exposed component, because obviously, if you want someone to be able to get on a VPN and they've got a new device and you don't want them to visit the office, then they obviously need to get into the portal to download the client. So a lot of customers have that. We'd prefer they didn't. We prefer they went into the office to get that, but that's just not always realistic. So a lot of customers have that as an internet-facing component. That means it's much more attacked. We've recently rewritten that in Go using very
memory safe language, right?
Yeah, and also using our most modern SSDLC process, which has evolved with the time. And I think a lot of vendors in this place, it's not like we are necessarily churning out code, really subpar below code for today's environment now. But our SSDLC processes 10 years ago were maybe not up to scratch for the threat environment now. And this is particularly true in firewalls because they tend to have much longer life cycles. And in our case, it was even more challenging than that, because some of this code comes from mergers and acquisitions. Sure. So it was written by a team that didn't follow my SSDLC process because they weren't my team at that point, if you follow me. So yeah, there's a lot of work to do. We've invested heavily. We're really focusing. It's like any other security problem. if you're too myopically focused on one part, you're probably going to fail. You need to, and the CSF is popular for a reason. You need to think about prevention, protection, initiatives, risk identification, governing all that, but also have a plan for failure detection and response. Other ways that we really like, that we find really effective are, for instance, bug bounty programs. We have our rewards for the firewall, I think, are up to 50K right now. I think we think that's industry leading, because the reality is finding everything internally is tough. And there's a big community out there that, if you harness them in the right way, can really help. We're a fan of that. It also acts as a forcing function for your vulnerability disclosure processes. So doing things like releasing CVEs, being very transparent to help your customers also respond, we think is very important.
Can I throw out another issue that's close to my heart, which is end of life devices, right? End of life software and end of life hardware. We know for a fact that the Volt Typhoon and other actors are particularly interested in finding and exploiting end-of-life devices. Manufacturers, they don't compel customers to stop using it once they've stopped supporting it, but it does seem like there's a public health risk for these devices that we need a way to address. I don't know who it falls to be the cop on the beat for that, but I'm interested in your thought, or Sophos' thought, on what do we do about all this end-of-life stuff.
I'm really glad that you brought that up, actually, because that's the third phase of the attacks that we saw. So as we got better and better at burning the operations and also shoring up our firewall platform as well, we just increasingly had this kind of end of life, which we call this digital detritus problem, where only the customers that are still our customers upgrading their devices are getting all these fixes. So you still end up with this kind of vulnerable old population that, as you say, it's not just about the risk to that organization. They might have a very kind of high risk tolerance. They might not care, frankly, but there's a greater risk to our kind of overall digital ecosystem. The one thing that we know is that we can act unilaterally on this. If we got really aggressive and push customers too hard, who have their budget constraints, who have their resource constraints, they're simply going to go to another vendor. That's not going to be good for our business, but it's also not going to be good for the ecosystem. So we'd love to see more kind of collaboration and standards on this. Even things like just standardizing on terminology, end of life versus end of sale, what they should be like, what steps are acceptable to take across your end of life population, what industry conventions around this area we think would be really helpful to
There's a public health epidemiologic angle to this, right? Which is, if we have vaccines, but we charge $300 for them, then okay, sure, affluent people will get vaccinated, but most people won't, and diseases will still spread. And that's what you're talking about, which is, listen, if I'm a small business, 5 or 10 person business, it's out of my budget to keep upgrading this device, but it seems to be doing what I bought it to do, so I'm just going to leave it. From their standpoint, that's fine, but from the broader public health standpoint, it's really a problem. Or the broadband routers or the smart TVs or whatever, right? As long as that smart TV is still showing me Netflix, I really don't care if it's running the latest software and is patched. And I actually don't really care if China's on it. But we as a society and we as an economy, we definitely care, because that becomes a platform for bigger, uglier attacks.
But absolutely. I think the start is just having a common standard on how long devices are supported for, when they get end of life. Look, it's impossible. People might say, why don't you just backport patches for forever? Hardware evolves. Right, we can't run our latest software on hardware that was built 10 years ago. So there's a backstop there. Risk also goes up. Obviously, the industry's very recently learned about the risks of a large widespread update going out across a lot of systems quickly.
Vendor will not be named. Yes.
If vendors we have to test these updates, and hardware changes over time, software changes over time. So you get this kind of combinatorial problem where you have to test on huge numbers of different versions of hardware and software. I mean, it just gets extremely complex. There's more problems, the more likelihood that you're going to screw that up. So there's a lot of good reasons why vendors can't can't support forever, or TPMs. Old devices don't have TPMs, and TPMs are keen for critical for kind of modern defenses. So yeah, I don't have the solution, but I certainly know it's an area that needs a lot of attention for a kind of collective digital resilience.
There needs to be some structure, right? Because right now it really comes down to the individual vendor, the individual customer. It's a wild west, as we would say here in the US, but I think we're seeing the result of that, which is very fertile ground for bad actors. Okay, final question. One of the big conclusions out there was that, as you said earlier, that nation state actors, China, are interested in high value targets, but they are also involved in campaigns against what we would not consider to be high value targets, usually as a precursor to these later stage campaigns. What do we need to do to adjust our defenses and approach to account for that?
I'll start by saying we shouldn't just assume that it's what the economists call it a negative externality, it's not just someone else's problem. Although in the case of orbs, that's likely the case. The attackers on your devices, they'll also do everything they can to rotate, to extract other value. So they'll steal your credentials from that device, and then they'll likely use that for credential stuffing campaigns in the future. And as I already said as well, even if you're not an espionage target, you might very well be critical infrastructure. And I think a lot of companies don't think of themselves as critical infrastructure, but they are.
Right.
Logistics.
Right.
You might be a small delivery company, but depending on what you're delivering, you're very likely critical infrastructure. A lot of examples of that, and of course, just from your own business perspective, lack of availability is going to hit you financially as well. So I think we definitely need to move past this idea that I'm not a target. There's nothing of value that I've got. That kind of apathy, which is particularly common maybe in the in the smaller end of the market. And enterprises more tuned into this, obviously intellectual property theft, that could be very damaging. I think there's a part to play for a wider policy part to play, like outside the kind of cyber realm, where we've essentially let IP theft go unpunished for a very long time. I think there's targeted economic sanctions, things like that. If there's a demonstrable kind of economic headwinds from products getting sold back into an American market, for example, which are clearly the result of IP theft. This is not simply a technical problem. It's increasingly a geopolitical problem that we need to solve as a society. I think if we just focus on the technical problems, it's an unfair fight in many ways. You've got a lot of very sophisticated people doing a lot of research. You can't expect even the Fortune 50 to do that on their own. There's a government part to play here as well. There's a legislation wider part.
Ross McKerchar, CISO at Sophos, thank you so much for joining us on Security Ledger Podcast, and love to have you on again.
Thank you.
If you liked what you heard, subscribe to the Security Ledger Podcast or check us out on your favorite podcast app, including Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Amazon Music.